Build a better world without China. The G7 offers a Western rival to Beijing's signature infrastructure project, the Belt and Road Initiative. Will developing nations benefit? And what's really behind this push against China? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Dareen Abughaida. Build back better. That's the main promise from the first G7 summit since the pandemic began. Leaders of the world's 7 main industrialized nations pledged, among many things, to tackle climate change and provide COVID-19 vaccines to the world's poor. Well, they also offered developing nations a rival to China's global investment and development strategy, the Belt and Road Initiative. Beijing was singled out in the summit's final communique for alleged human rights violations in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. The U.S. president says the G7 is determined to uphold democratic values around the world.
I really feel very strongly. I propose that we have a democratic alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative, to Build Back Better. They've agreed to that, and that's underway. As the details of that, we agreed that we put together a committee to do that and come up with that. And thirdly, that we are going to insist on high standards for a climate-friendly, transparent alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative. But in the meantime, we're going to move forward.
Well, the Chinese embassy in the UK has responded to the G7's communique. In a statement, a spokesperson said it distorted and reversed remarks on Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, deliberately slandered China and arbitrarily interfered in China's internal affairs, as well as exposing the sinister intentions of a few countries, such as the United States. Now, China's president set up the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. It involves development and investment projects across Asia, Europe, and beyond. More than 100 countries signed cooperation agreements with China on infrastructure projects. The initiative is estimated to include more than 2,600 projects with a combined value of $3.7 trillion. But China is accused of luring developing countries into a debt trap. It took control of Sri Lanka's second largest port after the country failed to make payments linked to the initiative. And critics also see it as a way of China extending its influence, while Beijing says the project connects hundreds of countries and improves transportation networks. Let's now bring in our guest. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Bruen, who's the former director of global engagement in the White House under President Barack Obama. He's also a former U.S. diplomat. And joining us from Cape Town is Sanusha Naidu, who's a senior research fellow at the Institute for Global Dialogue. That's a South African think tank. Thanks very much for speaking to us on Inside Story. Brett, since the announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative about 8 years ago, the G7 and particularly the Americans haven't come up with a concrete plan for that initiative. Why do you think they've come up with one now?
Well, clearly, we have seen Chinese influence grow, especially across the African continent, South and Central Asia. It was time. The West needs to be able to offer something more than just, principles and an occasional project. We need a more robust plan. So that's what you saw the beginnings of at this week's G7. The real question is, can they put more meat on the bone? Will this materialize into a massive program or just a big ambition?
Yeah, a lot of questions still unanswered. Thanks for that, Brett. Sanusha, over to you. This initiative was previously talked about by the U.S. President Joe Biden. But what do you make of the timing of this announcement at the G Summit?
Good day. Yeah, I think the timing is quite interesting because it's been a very aggressive push by President Biden linked back to his domestic policy as well with the B3W initiative announced at the G7 over the weekend. And I think what's interesting about it is the tone, the way in which it's being packaged as an initiative, talking about transparent infrastructure programs, projects, talking about standard norms and values, talking about accountability, and also trying to link the program to a kind of I don't know, it's very interesting to look at it in the context of dividing the world into democracies and autocracies. And I think, again, we're going back to a kind of Cold War redux with this kind of rhetoric language. But I have to also say that I agree with Brett that we have to see what kind of flesh is given to this whole kind of a program. I mean, at the moment, it's still very much a conception of what's going to happen. And it's not necessarily giving us details about the amount of money that this program will have, how the funding will be structured, what kind of projects. We know the themes around the projects, but in terms of what levels of conditions that will be set where a recipient country can actually apply for funds. So it's a kind of a return to the development finance agenda and how the G7, in particular, the US wants to push forward on this. But at this point in time, I think the details still need to be fleshed out.
So, Sanusha, are you getting any idea at all of how this project is actually going to be implemented and who's going to come up with the money for the development? They're saying that they'd like to close a $40 trillion infrastructure gap in developing countries by 2035, but still lacking a lot of detail.
Well, you're right. One of the key drivers, I think, for this project is the relationship that the private sector is going to have. How the private sector is also going to contribute to these funds, to the development finance. How this money is going to be raised. Is it going to be raised in equity markets? Is it going to bring back development finance institutions? A kind of alternative to what we are now seeing as an incredible response by the Chinese. That this is kind of talking about the Belt Road Initiative and their kind of funding with regard to the Silk Road Fund and the Asia Infrastructure Investment Fund as well. So I think what's important here is how this money is going to come about, where the liquidity lies, where the equity lies, and how this is going to tie in. Is it going to be some kind of funding that's also going to be renewing the World Bank in these projects as well? So there's a whole lot of uncertainty. But I can say that in terms of how it's going to play out in terms of geostrategic issues in Africa, which I have more knowledge of, I think it's definitely going to raise different dynamics. I mean, it's going to create more and more divisions, more dimensions around what level at which these kinds of projects are going to have geostrategic interest being playing out again in the continent around particular dynamics with regard to whether it finds the traction around countering the Belt Road Initiative and how that Belt Road Initiative has currently found traction in the continent. Let me be also clear. I think we're also trying to understand in Africa what are Belt Road Initiative projects and how these are being financed and operationalized in the continent. So I think at this point in time, it's still very much looking at this initiative and asking ourselves, what does it mean going forward? And we don't want to see this kind of binary kind of approach to the way development finance is considered in the continent as well.
Okay, we'll get onto the issue of geopolitics in a moment. You raise a couple of really good points. But Brett, let me ask you this. Will the lack of detail backfire on this project? Because, some people say, well, look, the Belt and Road Initiative is very clear. China's saying, you give me money, we're building infrastructure, you give me money and I'll give you money. So what is the U.S.'s strategy here?
Well, there certainly is a risk because they are elevating the expectations. And if they fail to deliver, I think that would certainly undermine confidence in the West, in the United States. So you have to be careful with these things. You want to have the big deliverable. You want to be able to add pressure, not only to the domestic front where Biden is going to need to find all of this money, but also on your allies. And a lot of those are still open questions. One issue here is that Joe Biden has laid out a foreign policy which he says is going to focus squarely on the American worker. And in fact, when they announced the 500 million doses of Pfizer vaccines headed to developing countries, he emphasized the fact that it was going to help American workers. The weakness in the Belt and Road Initiative has been that there are so many Chinese workers that are shipped over to these countries to do the project. And I think that is really going to be a tension here if, in fact, this is going to not just, install new infrastructure, but is it going to build the human infrastructure across the developing world that is so desperately needed?
And joining us on the phone from Beijing is Einar Tangen, who's a political analyst and economic development specialist focusing on China. Thanks for your time with us on Inside Story. What is your reaction to this announcement by the G7 nations of the new initiative?
Well, it's a little bit empty. I mean, obviously focused on China, but there are really no details. We don't really know what they're going to do with their plan. The COVID vaccine itself, the donations, unfortunately, that will be a bit late, given that there's no timetable, that they're looking at maybe next year or end of the year. I mean, right now, China's, I think it's 2 weeks ago, they had exported 350 million doses of vaccine, entered into agreements with 8 countries to produce the vaccine, and we're in negotiation with 10 other countries.
Right. But when it comes to the announcement that was made to rival Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative by establishing their own initiative, I mean, are they directly trying to undermine the Belt and Road Initiative, or what do you think is behind that?
Well, obviously, it's seen as a competitive issue. The U.S. feels it's behind, and then it needs to respond. As you know, the Belt and Road Initiative has been in operation for many, many years. At this point, it seems to be an issue that Biden sees it as a threat. Otherwise, he wouldn't be responding. But, you know, it's fine to talk about $40 trillion worth of needs, but you have to put more out there than we intend to have a public-private partnership that goes. I mean, obviously, it's, you know, they'll be not reinventing the wheel. They'll be doing a lot of the similar things that they've done through the IMF and also through the World Bank. But, you know, it's going to require another separate set of bureaucracy. There's going to have to be more implementation. This is going to take time. So it's not clear what it all means or what the timetable is or how it will be paid for. Because remember, this is depending on a lot of private financing, but that could change dramatically if, in fact, we do hit a recession. You start to see rates, bank rates go up, and people become concerned and start paying off their loans.
Well, you know, some people say, Einar, I'll stick with you for just a moment. Some people say that under the U.S. President Joe Biden, there's an ongoing attempt to sort of reframe the G7 as the representative and champion of the democratic world and the struggle against autocracy, meaning China. So how much of this is actually also a pushback against Beijing when it comes to issues of real concern for many countries, such as human rights, such as support for Taiwan, and demands more lately to reveal more about the COVID-19 pandemic and how it actually started?
Okay. So, and you've named a number of issues. From Beijing's point of view, they see a lot of false narratives. They think their handling of COVID-19 was pretty good. There were some problems in the first couple of weeks with local officials who didn't understand the complexity or the gravity of what they were involved with. But thereafter, Beijing thought that they were very transparent. They've tried to cooperate, but they have a sense that all their efforts to cooperate are just giving oxygen to a lot of conspiracy theories. They thought that the science had come back and identified that this was, you know, a high probability pass through from animals to humans, and now we're hearing about this COVID leak. In terms of, you know, human rights and things like that, China has its own narrative on this. They believe that they are doing the right thing, both in Hong Kong to quell what was in essence, you know, civil unrest that was destroying the tourist economy of Hong Kong. In Xinjiang, they really do believe that they are making a difference, that they're doing the same thing, in essence, that they did in the rest of China, which is insisting that people be able to speak the common language, which is Putonghua, that they have access to skills, education, and therefore economic opportunity. So, you know, there's obviously dueling narratives. A lot of it seems to be ideological. From China's perspective, they see the U.S. trying to hold on to its hegemony against a rising power. They do not see themselves as a threat to the U.S., but obviously they think the U.S. sees them as a threat.
Okay, Brett, how much of this project has to do with pressuring China on issues that I just mentioned, such as human rights and Taiwan and the treatment of the Uyghur Muslims? And will this actually have an impact on China?
I think this particular infrastructure initiative is less about putting pressure on internal issues in China and more about the external factor. Will countries, particularly in the developing world, cast their lot in with China, with their autocratic approach to governing, or are they going to stay with the West, with democracy? That's the current challenge for the G7 countries and for others, is can they win back some of the support that has been waning? And obviously what has happened here in the United States over the last several years with our politics has raised a lot of questions in foreign capitals as to whether or not Washington is a reliable ally. And I think part of what President Biden is trying to do is one of the old strategies we used to use in the White House, which is you build a big, bold initiative that is going to outlive your time in office in the hopes that that will actually get the ball rolling in a direction that will make it more difficult, and whomever the next president is, to change course. And so I think that's what we're seeing happen right now with this announcement.
Sanusha, over in South Africa, how would the country be viewing this? Because as Brett was just saying, this is not only about sort of confronting China, but about presenting a positive alternative to the world. Mm-hmm. But the BRI is really a result of China's relationship with the developing world.
Mm-hmm. I think in South Africa, you'll have 2 or 3 different narratives. You'll have the narrative from government who will see this as not infringing on their independent foreign policy, to be able to decide who they want to engage with and how they want to engage with. And more importantly, it's about understanding that the world is evolving in such a rapid way that you don't just put your lot in one particular basket. And I think that's what we're seeing in the context of President Ramaphosa and how he's leveraging the different avenues of the foreign policy by attending the G7, but also engaging with actors from the global South, in particular countries like China, India, through the BRICS and so forth. Now, I think in the public domain, in the broader public domain, and in that context of the broader South African public, there may be different reactions. I think we are beginning to see different narratives emerge around the reaction to China. Some of this narrative is not positive; it's a negative narrative, and again, it'll have different implications. But I think in the broader context of Africa, we've got to recognize that Africa is not a continent that does not have agency. It acts with agency, and we've got to realize that this is about what does the developing world, in particular Africa, want out of these engagements. And I think when you see the way in which the framing of this initiative had been put out, it becomes very reductionist in the way that it assumes that the developing world can actually take sides in this. And I think at this point in time in the 21st century, this is not what we're talking about. We're talking about the fact that the developing world has agency and can decide for itself how it wants to engage in terms of the development agenda, and more importantly, the infrastructure deficits that we are talking about in terms of the kinds of engagements we want, but also the engagement that allows for independent thought, independence in terms of how we want to engage, but what is the best way in which we maximize the benefit for our continent?
Not only the continent, Brett, excuse me, but to what extent does the G7 itself and European countries have a balancing act right now to pull off when it comes to challenging China as well as cooperating with China? Because some G7 leaders, you have the Italian Prime Minister, for example, who has reportedly urged Joe Biden not to push competition with China to the extent that it can prevent cooperation on other important issues like climate change.
Well, you see across the board a bit of a mixed message, even from the United States, saying on the one hand, we want to compete, in some cases we want to challenge China's behavior that runs afoul of international law. But on the other hand, they are saying we want to cooperate in areas like climate change. And as you mentioned, there are varying opinions across the G7. Some countries like Italy, Germany, have very strong economic ties that they are loath to put at risk by cracking down. And we have seen China take retaliatory steps when countries have even spoken out critically of some of the actions, for instance, in Xinjiang province. So I think we are going to have a real difficulty in trying to move in unison. And this is the challenge that lays before the Biden administration. You saw it play out in that statement, which did not go as far as the White House would have liked to have seen, but it was still a step. It was the first statement of the G7 in several years that directly addressed China and some of the human rights issues. I would take issue with my co-panelists and suggest that these aren't just about differing narratives. I mean, there are gross human rights violations taking place against the Uyghur population, against those fighting for democracy and human rights in Hong Kong. So I think we have to be clear-eyed about what we are looking at. And let's also understand that China is in an awkward position here because they, on the one hand, are trying to argue that no one should pay attention to what's going on in their country. And yet, on the other hand, they are very actively trying to pressure countries to take steps to follow their lead, to follow Beijing's line. So I think China is in an untenable position, and what you're seeing the G7 do is try to just add more pressure onto that line.
Einar, does this actually pressure China?
No, it actually doesn't. I understand where Brett is coming from. He's basically following the party line on this. It's a bipartisan issue in the U.S., but for China, they really don't see that. They see this as a false narrative. As
but
I've
what
said
are you
before,
what are you basing that on, Einar?
Well, let's base it on the fact that if you go through almost any report that is saying that there's something wrong with Xinjiang, it's from worker abuse to women being forcibly sterilized, to 1 million people in camps and things like this, all of these things, they stem from one individual, this guy named Adrian Zenz. And Adrian Zenz is on the payroll of the Jamestown Foundation, which was headed by Casey, who was the former head of the CIA, and has very close ties to the National Endowment for Democracy, which was created in the wake of the Iran-Contra arms for oil controversy during, I should say more than controversy, illegal activity that was during the Reagan administration. It all sounds very convoluted, but the fact is, it's from the Chinese perspective, it's a disinformation campaign aimed at doing exactly what my colleague is trying to do, which is to cast doubt that China's doing it. Let's look at the facts. China is the only nation who has addressed serious poverty. They're the ones who have, seen an 18% increase in the population of Xinjiang, despite a decrease in the overall population over the last 10 years. They've eradicated extreme poverty. They provided jobs. This forced labor narrative, from their perspective, is they have been subsidizing companies to go to Xinjiang because they're trying to train the people there to have basic skills and have companies where they can go and work. So when I say narratives, what I'm really talking about is an ideological warfare.
Okay, hang on a second, because we're just coming up to the end of the program, but I do have to give Brett the time to respond to that. Brett, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the easiest way to respond is if there's nothing to hide, then there sure are a lot of police trying to bar international journalists, whether it's from Al Jazeera, BBC, CNN, from seeing anything that's happening in Xinjiang province, or for that matter, on the streets of Hong Kong. So I think the challenge the Chinese have is one of facing just increasing scrutiny and realizing that they are not going to be able to hold the world at bay, and certainly when it comes to the origins of COVID-19, and you've heard it from the World Health Organization, we've got to have more transparency. They owe it to the world.
Okay, thank you so much. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you for joining us, Brett Bruen, Sanusha Naidu, and Einar Tangen. Well, thank you for watching. You can see the program and all our previous programs as well, again, anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is AJ Inside Story from myself and the whole team right here in Doha. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye for now.